Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. Now, since it's going to be a little while before we get to anything new in the game to analyze, I thought I'd begin this episode by going back and digging a little deeper into some concepts that I've brought up before. So, I've talked a lot about how important context is for translation. And one of the reasons that matters so much is that it's crucial to helping you get at the meaning of what's behind the words or phrases that are being used in the game. Remember, it's not so much the word-for-word translation that matters as the thought-to-thought translation. And it wasn't too long ago that I actually ran across what I think is a great example of these concepts in action, and entirely in English. In the 1934 science fiction short story A Martian Odyssey, the main character runs across an alien life form and they're sort of able to communicate. Their shared vocabulary is limited and basic, but the alien creature is able to use those basic terms in order to get across higher order concepts. What ends up being key is the use of mathematics and the phrases 112 or 224 in order to get across the idea of reasoning or logic. So when the main character in the story encounters a creature that has no ability to reason whatsoever, the alien informs him that the creature can know 112, know 224. Later, when they run across another creature, the first alien creature informs the main character that, in this creature's case, it's yes 112, no 224. And as you might be able to tell, the idea is that this new find is capable of some reasoning, but not too much, and some of its thought processes are mysterious. And the reason I think this is such a great example, the reason I'm even bringing this up, is that it really shows how arbitrary some of the individual terms are. If the phrases had been yes 448, no 5525, the same basic meaning would be getting across. And sometimes in translation, it's really easy to get caught up on the 112s and the specific mathematical terms. But what's really important is that core idea. Anyway, I thought I'd share that example with you, and I hope you found it interesting. Now I'm going to knock on this door.
We've the deepest gratitude for the church and all they do for us. The deepest, widest gratitude. Yes. Yes.
Well, that is a suspiciously obsequious response. Though I guess it's better than some of the rudeness and suspicion we've encountered up to now, even if it does seem to be inspired by fear. While we're here, though, there was one more door that I wanted to knock on.
Praise you. Praise the old damn church. And then best of luck hunting. Best luck of all.
So there are a few common threads between these two conversations, but from a translation point of view, one of the most interesting things I think there is about these lines is their reliance on voice acting, particularly that first set of lines. In fact, I think it's best demonstrated by me simply reading them over again. We've the deepest gratitude for the church and all they do for us. The deepest, widest gratitude. Yes. And obviously, read like that, it conveys an entirely different meaning to the player. And this actually gets back to the point that I was making before. When you're doing a translation, the important thing to get at and to recreate is the core meaning. These dialogues aren't meant to convey an actual deep respect for the healing church. But if they were left as unspoken text lines, they would be a little bit harder to interpret properly. Now this is a bit more true for the first dialogue than the second, because in the second dialogue you have the praise the whole damn church line, which even in text I imagine would get across something of the right idea. But even with that said, I feel like this is a really clear example of how voice acting can be a critical part of presenting a translation to a player. When those lines are delivered in that specific tone, they convey a lot more information than they would simply as text. This is one of many reasons why translation and localization often extend into the voice recording process. Sometimes, when studios know a work is going to be released dubbed into another language, they'll even include extra lines of notes and information in order to make sure that the translators and the voice actors are getting things right. And this can be very helpful because sometimes two different languages will express similar sentiments in very different ways. Sarcasm, for instance, tends to be a lot more common in English than it is in Japanese, and it's also a form of expression that doesn't necessarily lend itself well to being conveyed purely by text. So if you run across a situation where a character is being sarcastic in Japanese, or the words that they're saying don't necessarily reflect the emotions they're trying to get across, it can be helpful to have a note right there to give you the character's motivations for that particular line. Really, the impression that I get is that translation for voice acting is its own specialty, and it's an area I only have limited experience with. But, as I hope you can see from those dialogues here in the game, adding in those voices with just the right tones can really bring a lot to the meaning that you want to convey. But let's get back to some text descriptions on this next set of attire. Black Church Hat. Attire of Healing Church Hunters. Most Healing Church Hunters are elementary doctors who understand the importance of early prevention of the scourge, achieved by disposing of victims, and even potential victims, before signs of sickness manifest themselves. Their black attire is synonymous with fear and that peculiar yarn of madness. Now for the garb. Black Church Garb. Attire of Healing Church Hunters. The holy shawl, symbol of the Healing Church, flutters proudly on their backs. And for this piece of attire, that's all I'm going to read because the rest of the description is the same. Now the gloves. Surgical long gloves. White surgical gloves. The intricate embroidery weaves a spell that protects their wearer. The church engages in the hunt in a medical capacity. When a cancer is discovered, one must pinpoint its location, reach in, and wrench it from the host's bosom. Alright, that's the Black Church set. And I'll put the Black Church trousers up on the screen here so you can see, but their description is the same as the hat. So I feel like for the most part, these translations are pretty straightforward and well done. One thing I do think it would be interesting to discuss in relation to them, though, is the addition of information. So let's compare the official and a more literal translation of the surgical long gloves. Long white gloves used in surgery. The fine embroidery protects those who use them with a spell. The church's hunt is a type of medical activity, and it is direct contact and extraction that are the most important things. So, as you can see, it's a pretty straightforward translation. The biggest difference is probably in that last line, and the reason it comes across as so different is mostly because of added information. But without that information, the translation sounds stilted, ambiguous, and a little bit weak. The more literal, it is direct contact and extraction that are the most important things, just sounds weird. The most important things about what and to whom. What exactly is being directly contacted and what exactly is being extracted. And most importantly of all, what is this line trying to get across to the player? Now, again, the official version is, when a cancer is discovered, one must pinpoint its location, reach in, and wrench it from the host's bosom. So they've gone with cancer for the thing that's being extracted, both the cancer and the host's bosom for what are being directly contacted, and what seems to be the overall philosophy for the most important thing. By the way, now that I'm on this item screen, let me just quickly note that in both Japanese and English, the description for the twin bloodstone shards is exactly the same as the description for the bloodstone shard. And now I wanted to get back to the idea that the most important thing for these healing church doctors is this preventative medicine. Both because I think that's an accurate reading, and because I think it helps get at why this line was included. I think that it's pretty clearly meant to sound horrific. Remember that the area where we picked this up has two other residents of the Cathedral Ward that we can talk to, and neither of them seem to have very high opinions of the healing church. If anything, they seem to be afraid. And if there's a chance these healing church doctors might show up and wrench cancers from their bosoms before they show any symptoms, you can understand why they might be. But now let's take a break and see what happens if I knock on this door.
The password.
Well, I don't know what to say to that, so I guess I'll say nothing.
The password.
So this guy actually does have some variations to his insane mumblings, but I'm just going to move on for now. Before we get to him though, I wanted to go back and finish the point I was making about the surgical long gloves. Because it's not just the words of the citizens of the Cathedral Ward that we have as evidence that people were afraid of these black church doctors. The other items in the set all end with the lines, "Their black attire is synonymous with fear and that peculiar Yarnum madness." So I think this example of the black church doctor's medical philosophy is in here to give you a concrete reason for why people are so afraid of them. It also gives you something of an insight into how the healing church works. Now let's go back and look at that literal translation again. The church's hunt is a type of medical activity, and it is direct contact and extraction that are the most important things. I think you can see pretty clearly here how the vagueness actually hurts the point of this line. It just doesn't reach out and grab you in the same way. You don't instinctively feel the horror that you do when you read the official version. And it's also less clear about this being healing church philosophy. So to get back to an even more general point, I happen to think that you should pretty much always be careful when you're adding in words or lines to make something sound smoother. You don't want to accidentally deviate from the ultimate meaning of a line. That having been said, I think the surgical long gloves are a great example of how you can add in information to not only make a line sound smoother, but also to stay more true to the original meaning. Now I did briefly want to get back to the man who was mumbling behind that gate, because notably those insane ramblings don't take place in the Japanese audio version of the game. And with that having been noted, let's take a look at this item. Numbing Mist. Throw it to create a mist cloud that numbs a hunter's life essence and prevents restoration of HP. Said to be used by the blood hunters of Canehurst, its recipe is a secret closely guarded by the line of nobles inhabiting the castle. So for the most part this is a pretty straightforward translation, but I'd like to draw your attention to one specific phrase. The Japanese in question here is ikiru chikara sono kankaku, and as you can see, it's a phrase that's also repeated on the blood vial. Literally this would translate to something like the power to live, that feeling. It's this phrase that's being translated as life essence on the numbing mist, and invigorating on the blood vial. I've also previously made note of this translation when I talked about Yosefka's blood vial, and if you take a look, you'll see why. It uses a very similar phrase. It refers to the kankaku koka of the Yosefka's blood vial being higher than ordinary, and that leading to increased HP. Kankaku koka is literally the effect of that feeling, and it's been translated as highly invigorating. So by looking closely at these descriptions, we can see that once again, HP regeneration is tied very strongly to this euphoric feeling, specifically because the numbing mist blocks that feeling and prevents the healing. But now for the next item description. Black Messenger Hat. Hat that messengers are oddly fond of, symbol of the preventative hunters of the healing church. The inhabitants of the stump appear to have an interest in adornment. Why not let them be happy and revel as babes? There are a couple things that I like about this translation, and appropriately enough, the first one is actually that first line. A more literal translation might be, hat that the messengers wear for some reason, and that just seems dull compared to hat that the messengers are oddly fond of. I particularly like the use of the word oddly to get across the idea that it's unclear why the messengers like this particular item, as opposed to the more literal, for some reason. It not only sounds more natural, it seems more mysterious to me, and I think that's fitting. The other thing that I really like about this particular translation is that very last line, why not let them be happy and revel as babes? A more literal version might be, since the messengers are childish anyway, why not let them enjoy themselves if it brings them happiness? The official version is not only more succinct here, but it also does a better job of capturing the feel of the Japanese, because the specific phrasing that's used in the original is fairly unusual. Matching that with a similar kind of unusual phrasing in the English, therefore, only makes sense. This gets back to the idea of trying to capture the tone of the original as much as possible, and I think in this particular case, it's been done great. And now it's time we had another chat with Eileen the Crow.
Oh, hello there. Perfect timing. I must warn you not to go near the tomb below Erden Chapel in the Cathedral Ward. Henryk, an old hunter, has gone mad. And he's my mark.
Well, thanks for the warning. Anything else I should know?
Don't go near the tomb below Erden Chapel in the Cathedral Ward. I have business there first.
Actually, now that you put it that way, I think that sounds kind of interesting. But while I'm on my way there, let's talk a little bit about that translation. Probably the most interesting thing here is the last line that she said. The English translation for the final line in Eileen's first dialogue is, "And he's my mark." And the last thing she says before she starts to laugh the second time you talk with her is, "I have business there first." But this is another one of those situations where in the Japanese the line is actually exactly the same. The line in question being, "Are wa watashi no emono sa ne." And literally that would translate to something like, "That's my prey." So clearly the first of those official translations, "and he's my mark," is the closest to that literal version. The second instance of that line, which she says after warning us again not to come here, is therefore something of an English language original. And this approach is something that we've seen many times before. It seems to have been a deliberate stylistic decision not to use as much repetition in the English as there is in the Japanese. And while I think this is a perfectly acceptable approach to translation, whenever I run across one of these lines, it always makes me want to try and analyze why they made the decisions they made. And in this case, I feel like the changes they made were very effective. One of the main reasons that I think this encounter happens at all is to introduce you to Eileen's line of work, so to speak. We've talked with her once before, at the outskirts of one of the entrances to the sewers. And at that point we find out that she's friendly. She gives us some advice as well as a couple different items. But up to this point, we're not really sure what she's doing out here or who she is. It's only in following this quest line that we start to find out some of the answers to those questions. So with that in mind as the main purpose behind this particular set of events, let's go back and take another look at the phrasing of some of those dialogues. She warns us not to go near the tomb below Erden Chapel in the Cathedral Ward because Henryk, an old hunter, has gone mad. And then she tells us that he is her mark. And already I think we've come across an interesting point. Remember that in the original Japanese, the term she uses here could be more literally translated as prey. And we've already seen them use that term in the English version for the bosses that we defeat. Yet when they translated that word for Eileen, they decided to use the term mark. And I, for one, happen to associate that term more strongly with assassins than I do with hunters. Now think back to that second dialogue. She says, "Don't go near the tomb below Erden Chapel in the Cathedral Ward. I have business there first." Arguably, this new phrasing accomplishes at least three things. First, for me personally anyway, it continues the association with assassins. Second, it lets you know that the fight that takes place here is Eileen's business. And third, it serves as a surface-level warning for us as the player not to come here. Or at least, not to come here if we don't want to fight. So while that line is a departure from the original Japanese, which is just a repeated version of what she's said before, I feel like the change is a good one and perfectly in line with the theme behind this questline. Speaking of which...
That wasn't necessary of you, but you have my thanks. We made it with our lives. You're not bad at all. You must have killed Gascoigne as well, then. He was falling apart, I'm sure it had to be done. But try to keep your hands clean. A hunter should hunt beasts. Leave the hunting of hunters to me.
Okay, anything else to say?
Try to keep your hands clean. Leave the hunting of hunters to me.
And there you have it. Eileen is a hunter of hunters. And since most of the lines she gives you after the fight are pretty straightforwardly translated, I'd like to spend a little more time dwelling on that concept. Because at one point in that dialogue, she's very clear to differentiate between hunting beasts and hunting hunters. Her line in the English is, "A hunter should hunt beasts." A literal version of the Japanese line there is perhaps even more emphatic. She says, "You are a hunter, hunters should hunt beasts." And remember the translation of Amono here as mark instead of prey. I like the idea that Eileen would be making a deliberate distinction here. Ordinary hunters hunt prey, while she goes after her marks. And she does seem to be aware that this takes an extra toll on a hunter. Recall her reaction upon discovering that we were the ones who took out Father Gascoigne. She gives a heavy sigh and then says, "He was falling apart. I'm sure it had to be done." And in this case, I think the English translation does a better job of getting across the idea of her weary resignation. A more literal version might be, "He'd gone mad. I'm sure you did it in self-defense." But I think the real idea here is that being a hunter of hunters takes it out of you. Now though, I'd like to switch gears and talk about that rune we picked up. Air, a Carol rune that transcribes inhuman sounds. The air sees sentimentality in the warmth of blood and acknowledges visceral attacks as one of the darker hunter techniques. More blood echoes gained from visceral attacks. Perhaps the air is a hunter who bears the echoing will of those before him. There is a lot to talk about here. To give you an idea, I'm going to read over a more literal translation while I have the official version up on the screen. One of the Carol letters that expresses the sound of inhuman voices. The air is one who finds sentimentality in the warmth of blood, and obtains the dying will of blood from visceral attacks, which are one of the darker aspects of a hunter. This is what it is to be a hunter. They are, in other words, heirs to the dying will of blood. So, probably the most significant change here once again involves the term blood echoes. This is why in the more literal version I just read you, I stuck with the term dying will of blood, because the Japanese is making clever use of that phrase's literal meaning as well as its use as a game term. The inheritor or successor or heir of the dying will of blood gains more blood echoes when they're spattered with warm blood from a visceral attack. This is part of what the official English version is trying to get at when they write, "Perhaps the heir is a hunter who bears the echoing will of those before him." Remember also that the doll has a line when we first speak to her telling us to pursue the echoes of blood. So if you can connect the echoing will of those before and the echoes of blood, you can draw the connection that's there in the Japanese. But again, since this is a critical game term that's involved, there's not a whole lot that they can change. With all of that having been said though, I happen to think that there are some great translation choices here, including air, visceral attack, and rune. But that's all the time I have for now. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for me, I'd love to hear them. Thanks for watching, everyone.